Very good morning to all of you joining us in Europe. Good afternoon to those joining in Asia, Australia, and of course, hello to everyone in between. Welcome to the 26th session of the Asia Undercurrent webinar, which looks at the topic that is very dear personally to my heart, and that is the role of Europe in the Indo-Pacific, or how the title has it, how can Europe and Indo-Pacific partners join forces for a more secure and stable region. My name is Eva Pejsova. I hold the Japan chair at CSDS in Brussels, and it is my great pleasure to be guiding you through this fascinating session over the next 75 minutes. Now, before we start, a quick reminder, please do send us your questions if you have not yet done so. If you are watching us on Nikkei channel or YouTube Live, you can scroll down at the very bottom and you'll find a link to do so. If you could give us your affiliation or the country where you're connecting from, that would be fantastic. Now, of course, the topic of today is not entirely new, but it seems to be getting hotter and timely by the day. I think all of you who have connected are interested in what Europe has to bring to Indo-Pacific security. We have seen this outburst of initiatives over the past decade on the EU level, individual member states, be it France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, or even the smaller countries, but also through NATO's increasing engagement with its four Indo-Pacific partners. Now, of course, the war in Ukraine and Russia's unjustified invasion, the growing strategic alignment between Russia and China has given a major impetus and highlighted the interconnectedness between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic strategic theaters, which is no longer some sort of theoretical conceptual framework, but an everyday reality. We see in Russia's attacks, cyber attacks all over in Asia. We are seeing North Korean troops in Ukraine. So that is one thing that has brought the two regions very importantly together. And more recently, of course, the re-election of Donald Trump into the White House has reshuffled the cards and have put an additional pressure on its allies worldwide. Events are accelerating as we speak. The EU delegation is in Beijing for EU-China summit, and just yesterday, we have seen the conclusion of the EU-Japan summit. So things are moving on at an incredible pace, which is good for this seminar. Many questions to address from security, defense, to economic security, to the future of liberal international order, you name it. We only have more than an hour to do so, and I'm more than delighted to be in the best possible company with three outstanding speakers from Europe, Japan, and Australia. And I'm talking of, well, I will not introduce all your impressive curricula. You have seen that in the bios. Dr. Giulio Pugliese, who's a lecturer in strategic communication at King's College London, and the director of the EU Asia project at the European University Institute in Florence. Dr. Michito Tsuruoka on the Japanese side, professor at the Keio University and deputy director of the Keio Center for Strategy, a longtime observer of Europe-Japan ties especially. And finally, certainly not last, Professor Rory Medcalf, the head of the National Security College of the Australian National University, a renowned expert on not just Australian national security, but Indo-Pacific concept in general. So what we will do, we will start with the first round of kind of more kickoff remarks of each of the three speakers. And I'll start, because the topic is Europe, I'll start with our European one, Giulio. What do you see? I mean, you have been observing, of course, the European pivot engagement in the Indo-Pacific for many years now. How has it been evolving? What are the main challenges? What can we expect from Europe in the Indo-Pacific and in cooperation with its key partners, especially Japan today, please?
Thank you, Eva. It's a privilege to be here. I'm delighted to be in such excellent company, and I hope to keep up with the high standard of the discussions we will likely have. So thank you, Nikkei, and Government of Japan also for the invitation. I would tackle your question, Eva, by deconstructing from the get-go, actually, what is effectively a socially reimagined space, the Indo-Pacific, and bring back a historical perspective that tries to give a sense of where we're getting at in terms also of EU Indo-Pacific cooperation and EU Japan cooperation. We should be cognizant that the Indo-Pacific is effectively a new term. Rory has actually written about it. I have his book here in the library somewhere. And it is, to all effects, a strategic and geopolitical construct that changes entirely the way we understand what used to be called the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific was, in many ways, a bottom-up epistemic communities-led construct that took stock of economic regionalization, yes, in the context of the Cold War, so there were always strategic undertones to it, but it was effectively developed by business economists and development economists to effectually try to anchor Japan, the United States, Australia, and other large economies to the growing opportunities offered by Southeast Asia's growth, and pull it away also from the communist camp. And then with the enlistment of China into effectively Soviet containment, also China. This has actually been pushed by the 1980s and 1990s by the governments, especially of Japan, Australia, the United States. And this is evident by the APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Framework, that actually wanted to take advantage of globalization, of the neoliberal grammar of globalization, to also engage China, which was undergoing a reform and opening up transition. And fast forward to the 2010s, we are effectively talking still about China when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, because it is in many ways a geopolitical construct that tries to pivot away from China. It is code in many ways to the need to engage polities and economies other than China, starting with Southeast Asia and India. And it's a top-down construct which was created in the policy planning units of major regional powers, starting with Japan. And it has been also leaders-led. So you see, we can actually compare the epistemics, grassroots-based logic of the Asia-Pacific with the geopolitical top-down logic of leader summits where maps were unveiled to get a buy-in from India, from the United States, and the policy planning staff of the United States eventually bought into the Indo-Pacific, the first time that the US government bought into a concept originating elsewhere in 2017. And then we get, to all effects, a buy-in from more and more regional players, including ASEAN with its outlook in the Indo-Pacific. And effectively, we have these recipes of taking advantage and stock of the economic vibrancy of the region, also in terms of de-risking away from China, so in terms of economic security and supply chain resilience, with the understanding of bolstering these polities and rimland states and like-minded maritime partners. What is interesting here, and in this very brief geopolitical and geoeconomic historical tour d'horizon, is the European buy-in, which we get in 2021 with the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And what we get here is very much the buy-in into growing security and political alignment, which is evidenced by the EU-Japan summit. We do get evidence of security and political cooperation by having security and defense cooperation as the first agenda item in the joint summit statement of the EU-Japan summit. And that's important because effectively views of China in Europe have soured. I will stick and focus on the EU with the reminder 3 minutes I was allocated, so I'll try to avoid blabbing. Please do interject if I go over time. Because China's assertiveness has been evident in its wolf warrior diplomacy during the COVID-19 crisis, and also in the stifling of the semi-autonomy of Hong Kong around the same time. And to all effects, the evidence that trade and economic asymmetries were taken advantage of since then. So that, along with, when we need to be honest here also, US push and moral suasion campaigns that were effectively started with the first Trump administration. Let's not forget that the NATO IP4 cooperation was really incubated under the first Trump administration. And the US has a lot of structural power. We are all cognizant of that as we actually sign two deals that contravene with the most favored nations' principles of free trade, with effectively the Trump administration's engaged in gangster coercion with friends and foes alike. And that leverage and that structural power, along with decreasing appreciations of China's role in international society in Europe, was really evidenced under the Geopolitical Commission of the von der Leyen presidency, and with the advent of a transatlanticist Biden administration, which took advantage of scale at allies level to effectively enforce a set of lattice work minilaterals that leveraged the allies in multiple agenda items, also in terms not just of security cooperation to effectively contain China, but also in terms of providing public goods to third parties in the context of strategic competition. And this was effectively crystallized with Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has hastened and collapsed really the alignment between the security alignment between the two theaters. And this was evident with reciprocity, with Japan, the ROK, Australia, helping us out financially, diplomatically, by coordinating sanctions, and by also providing support, including through triangulation, lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. And that's important because it further coalesced the views that we needed to play up and bolster cooperation among like-minded partners. And this has actually been particularly important in the context of a transatlanticist Biden administration. Now, I'll conclude with what is happening right now, because I'm cognizant of time, and it's already 7 minutes since I started my remarks. We are pulled into our respective neighborhoods because of the growing incognita surrounding what is to all effects a war economy in the east of Europe. Russia's rearmament is fast-paced, is fast moving forward, and Putin's war in Ukraine is to all effects a proxy war also for driving wedges between and within the EU, but also between NATO allies, notably across the Atlantic Ocean. And so we need to be cognizant that resources are finite, and there is indeed a very different approach from the second Trump administration, not just in terms of arm-twisting allies, in terms of greater military spending, and at the same time levying punitive tariffs, even in the context of potential deals against foes and friends alike. But there is also an explicit request from policy planners in the Department of Defense for Europe to mind its own business in its neighborhood. And so certainly it is much easier to collaborate in security agenda items that transcend borders, such as cybersecurity, disinformation, what the EU refers to as foreign information manipulation interference, space security, and certainly joint defense cooperation. Cooperation and coordination, which may actually even sustain the United States grand strategy in terms of sustainment and in terms of preparing and logistical support in contingency scenarios. But let me conclude by saying that this is all a brave new world we are facing, and we need to be very cognizant also of the need for Europe and Indo-Pacific players to keep cornering Russia through sanctions. The EU has enforced a new package of sanctions, including to Chinese regional banks. And we need to also think about the importance of engaging with the so-called global south, a misnomer for emerging economies and developing countries, because of the vacuum left by the MAGA agenda and the detraction from development aid agencies, because those initiatives and the tariffs, which are levied also against developing countries and emerging economies, will bring even more political instability and even favor potential systemic rivals. So we need to chip in, need to cooperate in terms also of fostering capacity building in the economic sector towards these countries, and at the same time strive for conflict prevention. I think that all of us, just European, Japanese, and Australian speakers concord that the initiatives by the Japanese Ishiba administration, the Lee government in South Korea, and the Albanese government are striving for conflict prevention in the maritime security domains in East Asia, with an eye also on peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So let me conclude here, and sorry for actually being the over-loquacious Italian.
No problem at all. Thank you, Giulio. I think this was an excellent start. Also, thank you for kind of conceptualizing what we are talking about when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. I think the notion of freedom and openness really needs to be reminded. This was the kind of initial impetus that made it all happen. And thank you also for ending, at least for now, on the importance of crisis prevention, because I think that we will be talking about it quite a bit throughout this session. Now, let me move to the Japanese perspective. And I find, using Giulio's one of the last points he mentioned about the US prioritization. Yes, we are kind of being pushed into focusing more into our regions. So how does basically Japan see being itself in a rather difficult situation, both domestically, regionally, and vis-a-vis its US allies? Where does Europe still fit in? What's the rationale for Japan in cooperating and strengthening ties with Europeans, especially in security defense, but of course across the spectrum? Michito, please.
Oh, thank you very much. A great honor to be joining this conversation today. Yes, the first that Japan welcomes Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. So not only economic, but also the political and security and defense as well. So because it's in Japan's interest to have Europe on board, because we share various kinds of values and interests with Europe. So particularly given the fact that the relative weight and relative power of the United States is declining in this region and beyond. So it's always good for Japan to have more partners sharing values and sharing interest. And Europe is very much a part of that. And also, it's in Europe's interest to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific region, because Europe is more and more affected by what takes place in the Indo-Pacific region. So whether Europe likes it or not, it's in Europe's interest to remain engaged or to deepen its engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is not just about Trump. So this is a sort of a structural trend that is going to continue even after the Trump administration. But of course, at the same time, you can still argue that the fact that Mr. Trump and his administration is sort of making more distance from various core values like rules-based international order or multilateralism, free trade, and then we have more reasons. Europe and Japan have more reasons to cooperate in such an environment under the Trump administration. But this trend is going to continue, and this trend has been there. So the strengthening of cooperation between Europe and Japan started much earlier. And this is going to continue. And it's the basic point here is that it's in Japan's interest. So regardless of who sits in the White House, so this is something that the Tokyo has been very much working on, and it's in Europe's interest. And looking at a broader context of this, one of the most important things and the realities is the fact that the connectivity or interconnectedness between the two regions, Europe and Indo-Pacific region, has been increasing. So and that is why I very much believe that I think arguably the most important task for us is to, in terms of security and defense, is to prevent simultaneous contingencies, simultaneous crises in Europe and in the Pacific region. So, for example, that if something really serious happens over Taiwan, then the US will have to pay a lot of attention to the Indo-Pacific region, particularly Taiwan or the Western Pacific region, and that will affect US posture in Europe. So that is why that NATO has to take into account such possibilities in its defense planning, and vice versa in Japan and in the Pacific region as well. If something serious happens over the Baltic region, for example, so Russia's invasion into one of the Baltic states, for example, then assuming that, of course, NATO's commitment is still there, that the US will be involved, and that will affect US posture in the Pacific region. And that is why it is in Japan's interest to help deter Russia from invading NATO territories, and also vice versa. It's in Europe's interest to help deter China from invading Taiwan. So this is really a crucial and a point about connectivity, because yes, there are some Americans who are now saying that Europe needs to focus on Europe and Asia for Asia. But the problem here is that we will all be affected by what takes place in other parts of the world. So that is why we need to pay attention to what takes place in other regions, and that is why the permanent, regular, constant engagement in other regions is really important, and the importance of that is increasing. And finally, one more point about the context within which we now think of Europe-Japan and Europe-Indo-Pacific cooperation, and of course that is the United States. But I don't think it's a great idea for us to think about countering the United States. No, we are all the US allies, so NATO countries, and Japan, Korea, Australia, these are all US allies. So we have a lot of interest in keeping the Americans engaged in what we believe in, like a rules-based international order, or multilateralism, or free trade. So that is why that the sort of a strategy of anchoring type of thing is important. And but the sort of a bit tricky, a new element here is that now China is trying to give an impression that Beijing is more reasonable and more predictable than Washington, D.C. And yes, to some extent, in some limited areas, you can make such an argument. I fully understand that, but still, we should not lose a sort of a broader context of this, that we share much more with the United States even today than with China or other countries with which we don't share values. So always that it's really important for us to keep a sort of a sense of proportion and a broader context. And so that is why that I always argue that it's way too early to give up the United States. The US is our very important ally, and that is why that we need to continue our effort to keep Americans on board in our sort of a international efforts to maintain rules-based international order and other principles. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michito. I mean, three most important points that I couldn't agree with more. It is a structural trend. It is one that is here to stay, at least on the bilateral level. And the two challenges, the two needs that we need to now face, that is to prevent simultaneous contingencies, is really one thing that we need to absolutely focus on, but also anchoring the US within the current multilateral structures, because indeed reminding us that the US is still the key strategic ally here is extremely important, and we will probably dig deeper later on how it can be done and what concrete steps, including in the security defense cooperation between Japan and Europe, can help somehow move us closer to the goal of managing the contingencies. Now, let's move to the Australian perspective. We have talked a lot, of course, now on the bilateral level, Japan, Europe, but Australia has been one of the crucial US allies, is a key partner of both Japan and Europe in the Indo-Pacific, a key player on the Indo-Pacific strategic landscape. Rory, could you please give us your insight, initial remarks on what role can we see Australia playing in this, and perhaps are some of the opportunities in partnering closer with Japan and Europe?
Thank you. And look, I really commend the organisers of this conversation, and I'm grateful to my Italian and Japanese colleagues for setting the scene so well. Look, I agree also that this conversation is not about giving up on the United States, but it is about ensuring that as liberal democracies, as partners and allies, thinking globally, that we build as much scaffolding as we can for the liberal democratic order, for a rules-based system, and frankly, buy time as well, so that the United States in some form or another can still play a very substantial role. So I just want to put that thought there to begin with. And I will speak a bit about an Australian perspective and an Australian role in contributing to balance, stability, deterrence, rules in the Indo-Pacific, but also globally. But let's think about some other powers as well. So when I was thinking about the role of Japan and the role of Europe, and I should say that it's fantastic to see the Japan-Europe summit, and I think the very powerful and comprehensive statement that came out of that, so much like-mindedness across the distance. Let's think about the third leg to that triangle in a way. And that's not only Australia, but I think it is a number of other liberal democracies that are not Japan and not part of continental Europe or the European Union. So I'm thinking Australia, but I'm also thinking, for example, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand. There's ways in which the Four Eyes, if you like, can be an additional pole of influence and power and trust in this liberal democratic triangle. But let's go to an Australian perspective. So the China challenge that we've all alluded to, and the Trump shock, they're both making, I think, Australia more focused on the need to diversify and deepen its strategic relationships with other liberal democracies. And also, they're helping us understand that security is a much more holistic concept. It includes the economic dimension that I know we'll get to in a moment. It includes rules. Yes, of course, it includes military power as well. And so I think really that the direction of travel that Australia has been on over the last 15 to 20 years or so under the Indo-Pacific framework, and thank you to Giulio for acknowledging the sort of provenance of that, among countries in the region, Japan, but Australia had a big role there. We have been diversifying our relationships. We have been deepening our partnership with Japan. I think it's without question that Japan is Australia's best friend in Asia, a term that was once used 10 or 15 years ago to some sort of quizzical raising of eyebrows, but today I think is a very uncontroversial point to make. So a special strategic partnership, a military cooperation set of arrangements, cooperation in critical minerals, in energy, in logistics, in so many areas. And thankfully, I think Australia is beginning to wake up to the need to engage Europe as a strategic partner too. That hasn't always been obvious to Australian policymakers. I think that there's been a little bit of narrow thinking in the past in Australia whereby our region is our region and Europe is over there, and Europe's problems are not necessarily our problems, and Europe is not necessarily a decisive actor on the world stage. That thinking is changing, and I think that's now a bipartisan recognition across the Australian Parliament. So I'm excited, for example, that there's a revival of interest in the free trade agreement with Europe, between Australia and Europe, which I think will be much more than a commercial imperative. There'll be a strategic imperative to that. There's in principle agreement for Australia and the EU to pursue a security agreement, a security declaration as well. And I think in so many other areas, for example, even in looking to protect our democratic institutions, we need to be looking creatively at how Australia, Europe and Japan can collaborate. Now, a couple of final points before we go to the conversation. This isn't all going to be easy. I mean, for example, it's no secret that at the moment, Australia is, as we look to modernise our defence force and we're looking for the best anywhere in the world, we have our very good friends in Japan and our very good friends in Germany, and both have, I think, very impressive designs for a future frigate. And so there'll be a process in Australia to select either a Japanese or a German design for that frigate, and that's of commercial and strategic interest to both of those friends. So I hope, for example, that choice is managed well in a way that we all remain strategic partners. And I think our systems do have the maturity to manage decisions like that. But there will be commercial issues that we sometimes have to work through competition as well as collaboration. There's also a question about Australia's relationship with the United States and our alliance with the United States and how we are coping with the Trump shock. Quite controversial at the moment. We might get to AUKUS at some point in the conversation. The nuclear submarine technology sharing arrangement of Australia, the US and the United Kingdom, advanced technologies as well, and the questions that the Trump administration is raising about that. There's also the question of the Australia-China relationship, and of course Australia has been, from around 2016 until a few years ago, really an economic and diplomatic frontline state in dealing with Chinese coercion. In the last few years, we've had a stabilisation of the relationship with China, a recent visit by our Prime Minister to China, and that has also raised questions of, is Australia going too far too fast in stabilising relations with China? What does that mean for our solidarity with other liberal democracies? I think deep down our solidarity is there, it is strong, but we probably have to do a bit better with some of that diplomatic and political signalling. And look, the last point I wanted to make is that as Australia moves to a clearer understanding that security is a comprehensive thing, that it includes economic dimensions, it includes civil society, it includes politics and countering disinformation, we have to do as much as we can to share experience and capability with the most like-minded countries. And in terms of values and principles, it's hard to get more like-minded than Australia, Europe and Japan. And so I want to put a couple of ideas out there. One is, what can we do together on parliamentary dialogue, for example? And the other, of course, is the point that I think was already mentioned once or twice in the conversation. What can we do together diplomatically to prevent conflict here in the Indo-Pacific? I'll stop there, but I really look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rory. I really like your scaffolding metaphor. I think I'm going to be using it much more. I think it's a very good one. And indeed, we need to be creative. Also, thanks for reminding us of the comprehensive concept of security. I think we're all pretty much on board with that, and that's why we're also going to be talking about economic security aspects, among others. But I will go back to, or start by zooming into one specific aspect, or starting with the security defense cooperation, right? We have seen in the latest, well, yesterday's EU-Japan summit, and Giulio just reminded us that security defense was in the joint statement the #1 priority, which was really a new thing when we look at the bilateral relationship. And among the priorities, yes, we are talking about transnational challenges, hybrid, maritime, security, disinformation. There has been also progress on information sharing or classified information sharing, space cooperation, but one that really needs to be looked much, much deeper at is defense, industrial, and technological cooperation. I think we all agree that it is good for our own security on strengthening interoperability in the short term, in the long term. It's much needed for boosting our own defense industrial bases. And here I'm talking mostly, well, it applies for Australia as well, but mostly for Japan and Europe. And it is a clear common priority. Now we have, apparently there's an agreement now that there will be a 2+2 Japan-EU defense industrial dialogue starting off next year. That is good on paper, but let's see what is concretely out there. And I think to all of us who have been looking into this topic for some years, there is actually, a bit of a struggle to still convince our defense industries to join forces. And the one exception has been GCAP, of course, the next generation fighter jets joint project between Italy, the UK, and Japan that has been ongoing. I'm using the opportunity of having Giulio as an Italian here. How can we use GCAP, for instance, as an example? What concretely does it bring to Italy, but also other countries? Of course, there has been so much debate on who, how, when we can actually have other partners join. India, Australia have been among some of the potential candidates in the second phase, for instance. Do you see GCAP perhaps as a sort of a jumping board to more cooperation, or where do you see also where would you pin very concrete, if you can, opportunities for Japan to join forces with European defense industries, and how beneficial it would be? And Michito, get ready, because I will then get to your perspective on that topic.
Thank you. Be busy because of major in world politics. Oh my God. Can you hear me? I've lost you.
Now, yes.
Okay.
You're breaking. But perhaps we can wait for Giulio to fix his internet connection and go to Michito, if that's okay. I mean, from my own research, I've seen some of the reluctance perhaps of the Japanese defense industry or even academic sector, right, to engage fully in this concrete area. Where do you see that this political agreement will really kickstart basically this cooperation in practical terms?
Yeah, I very much believe that there's now a firm commitment and consensus on the value of GCAP for future of Japan. But the problem on the Japanese side is that it's literally the very first project for Japanese defense industries to fully cooperate with companies from other countries, particularly countries from the companies from countries other than the United States. So this is really a new thing, and Japan in the field of international defense equipment cooperation, Japan is a newcomer, so latecomer. So the GCAP provides Japanese actors a great opportunity to learn how international armament cooperation works and cannot work. So this is very much a learning thing for Japan. But at the same time, the going beyond that, the one of the quite interesting aspect of this is that is the fact that UK and Italy are NATO countries, which means that the GCAP will have to be 100% compatible with NATO standardization. So Japan is in the now process of learning the NATO standardization, so NATO STANAG, standardization agreements. But we are going to use new technologies, which means that Japan will be in a process of producing new NATO standardization, and this is really a exciting aspect for Japanese companies and Japanese defense industries. But actually, the one of the reasons why it has been reported that Japan has been quite reluctant to let others join this project, and that very much that sort of a concerns very much came from the fact that the managing three countries is already quite complicated and difficult and very new thing for Japan. So if you put one more country or two more, three more countries, then the things will become more complicated. And crucially, it could end up being delayed. So that's one of the biggest concerns, because Japan wants to have a new aircraft on time, so 2035. Of course, there's some people are quite skeptical about that, but still, the timing is really important for Japan.
Thank you very much, Michito. Timing is indeed important. Giulio, did you manage to fix your connection and have something to add from an Italian perspective?
Well, since Michito has said everything, I'll simply emphasize that indeed technological innovation has pushed the frontiers of financing new defense industrial projects into incredibly expensive and burdensome venues. And so countries with high debt, such as Italy, Japan, public debt, will have a lot of issues in financing single-handedly defense industrial projects. And so it makes much more sense, given the political and security interconnectedness that we talked about. And so that is the important baseline, that we are like-minded, to join forces and to pool financial resources and our respective technological and industrial strengths to build new technologies and defense, and venture into defense industrial cooperation. This is important also in the context of new financing schemes that will be available. The new Rearm Europe white paper makes it especially clear that if you have a security and defense partnership with the EU, you can actually access credit from funding schemes and the ability to make more public debt that does not contravene the Maastricht parameters. And this is important in the context of the EU having security and defense partnerships with South Korea, with Japan, and negotiating one, in fact, with Australia. So this will elicit more and more financing. And the information agreement negotiation that you mentioned, Eva, is also aimed at, in my opinion, fostering this specific defense industry dialogue and security in the economic domain, so that we can exchange information also in terms of collaboration in defense industrial cooperation. So I think this is important. I would still stress that the United States is an important actor. The Biden administration has blessed the GCAP. Trump administration has its own pet project and has a very keen interest in pushing for foreign military sales and US exports of its own equipment. So we will have to see how that agenda item also develops.
Thank you, Giulio. And I'm just looking at the time, and I can't believe it flew by so quickly, because there's just so much we need to discuss. And I would love to come back to Rory on AUKUS, because I've been living in France, and this is, an issue that has been constantly in the media, especially in the last half a year or so. So feel free to touch upon it. But I have to now at least start looking at some of the questions from the audience, and I'll try to somehow package this with the second round of questions that I wanted to ask, which was all about trade and tariffs and rare earth alliances that we have seen even in the latest EU-Japan summit again. So I would like to move a little bit away more to the sphere of technology, innovation, competitiveness, supply chains. Let us move away a little bit from the defense industrial side, although of course the two are very much connected. And my question then, and we can perhaps even start with Rory, is how can we build? I mean, we have seen the competitiveness alliance now at the EU-Japan level. We're talking about joint development of rare earth elements. We have seen the India-Canada agreement. We are seeing more and more linkages across the Indo-Pacific, horizontal cooperation, basically to strengthen supply chains, etc. Where is Australia? How do you see that evolving? What's the importance? Are we going to see a formation of a sort of a global, like-minded alliance among like-minded partners in the competitiveness field? And there's a link in it to this one question from the Indians. Audience is specifically about semiconductors, critical materials, and digital infrastructure. So how can Europe, Japan, and others uphold the rules-based economies without being strategically vulnerable to coercion? I think that's exactly the question.
Sure. Look, I'll jump in to begin with. Look, I mean, I think at a at a conceptual level, it's appealing to think of Australia as being part of a sort of tight set of relationships among liberal democracies globally, or indeed other democracies. So, you've mentioned India as well, to provide really a counterweight to China-centric supply chains, or supply chains where, if you like, a lot of the rules that we want to uphold are not being respected. And this is also, frankly, about ensuring that in times to come, if there are confrontations or crises, or even, heaven forbid, the potential of armed conflict involving China or a Taiwan contingency or something else, that we have supply chains that are separated from dependency on China. It's a nice idea. It's going to be very difficult to execute in practice. And I think the Australian experience already is that, yes, there's an in principle interest in diversification that grew with the Chinese economic coercion against Australia some years ago. It grew with the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Trump administration is not making that easy for us, as we all know, but also there's the critical question of the private sector. Who's making the investment decisions? How attractive is the investment climate going to be? Australia has aspirations, for example, to do a lot more work across the full spectrum of technology development. But fundamentally, Australia is a primary producer. Fundamentally, Australia has the minerals. Australia doesn't tend to have the cost structures or the workforce or the industrial capacity to look after the entire supply chain. Therefore, we need to be finding ways to be very innovative and coordinated in public-private partnerships, in encouraging private sector actors in Europe and Japan and others to look at Australia in a different light. There is a sort of a small piece of good news here. There's a new push in Australia regarding the challenges to our national productivity. So our Treasurer is quite fixated on improving the declining levels of Australian productivity. There's also, slightly in counterpoint to that, a push for Australia to do more manufacturing, and there's an obvious tension there. The way to reconcile some of this is to unlock more investment from trusted partners in Japan and Europe. So, private sector friends on this call, please knock on the door, but it is going to require constant attention, because Australia is much more enmeshed in China-centric supply chains, or indeed US-centric supply chains, than with our more diverse partners at this stage.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rory. I think, yes, well, I mean, you mentioned the trade-offs and the engagement with the private sector, and kind of reminds me also what Giulio said. It's a crucial question about financing, right? We all been now investing and managing our domestic audience, managing our expectations, because it's all very nice to go to 5%. In the case of Japan, perhaps 3%. I mean, big questions everywhere, but convincing our own democratic societies of the benefits of that is going to be a key challenge. Which brings me to, and I'll try to group those questions. I'll give you three kind of broad topics that you can pick and choose from. And one, I think, is a very interesting one. It starts with a huge amount of good come from China in the Indo-Pacific, and it refers to China's dominance in mostly the connectivity agenda on the Belt and Road, and of course asking whether in the sector of energy connectivity there is an alternative. I mean, I personally keep saying that there's space for all of us, in this sector, that competition is good, but that is one question. So good coming from China, alternative, how can we, or whatever, in the sphere of connectivity. One, more on the European side, referring to President Macron's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, calling for this coalition of independence. It seems to kind of revive the non-aligned movement 2.0 and an effort of Europe to call upon those stuck in the middle. So, what can we expect from Europe? Is it going to be more in line with what President Macron is kind of calling for, or a separate way? And I think Giulio can touch upon that. And still kind of on the notion of trade-offs, what shall we drop? Which ball shall we drop? And there's a question from Norway, what shall we do with development aid? Is it, of course, I'm aware these are all big topics, but perhaps could be connected to the connectivity one. And I'll probably leave it at that. I think we can still have space for a second round after this, if you keep it reasonably short. And of course, feel free to react to one another. Of course, I'm realizing the time is extremely short for this. So, Giulio, would you like to start on the European side, and then we go Michito and Rory?
I'll touch on the first two questions, and in fact echo much of what Rory has said. It is incredibly complicated in the connectivity, the so-called connectivity agenda item, to find the alignment of planets among donor countries, which many times are also competitors, because connectivity rhymes with investment. And we all have our industrial champions and our backyards that we want to cultivate. And it's complicated also to find receptiveness sometimes among recipient countries. So precisely because connectivity rhymes with investment and with political leverage sometimes, it is indeed complicated. What we can do is certainly exchange notes on who can do what, and so that we avoid at least duplicating projects. And interestingly enough, the EU and Japan have a framework that dates back to the Juncker era, the EU-Japan connectivity partnership, and we can leverage it through the Global Gateway. So it would be something that effectively echoes what Japan has been doing with Australia, the United States in the Pacific, for instance. And specific to the Macron question, yes, I think this is interesting because at the very same Shangri-La Dialogue, the Joint Chief of Defense Staff of the United Kingdom has also mentioned explicitly the requests by the United States of staying in their own theater, but by highlighting the costs and the merits of dispatching an aircraft carrier all the way to the Pacific, he emphasized that as of now, it's clearly not necessary in the context of Europe's war, Russia's war in Ukraine and Europe's need to bolster Ukraine. And so there are assets that can be dispatched at little economic and political costs. And in many ways, France is a resident power. So you will still see also military presence in the Pacific quadrant of the Indo-Pacific. While, of course, emphasizing this third way of trying to cater to the necessities of local players, striving for conflict prevention, and effectively pushing forward on the low-hanging fruits that I've mentioned earlier, those that transcend borders, such as cybersecurity, that is also emphasized in the EU-Japan summit, and cybersecurity capacity building, foreign information manipulation and interference, space cooperation, which can actually aid also connectivity, including intelligence sharing and communication connectivity. And the defense industrial cooperation can also add capacity in the context of deterrence and sustainment. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Giulio. Michito.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And first on the supply chain resilience, particularly when it comes to rare earths or critical minerals, the diversification of sources of such a material is not about self-sufficiency. So it's about maintaining alternatives. And that's exactly what Japan has been very much focused on over the past 10 to 15 years now. And so this means that if you are ready and if you have more alternatives, and if you let Chinese know that, then it becomes less likely for China to weaponize such materials. So this is what we are trying to achieve. So it's not about self-sufficiency. It's about maintaining alternatives and let China know about that. And that is really important. So it's part of sort of a deterrence thinking. And also the trade-off between our efforts to maintain unity among like-minded countries and our effort to get more countries on board, particularly in Southeast Asia. Because now and actually seen from Tokyo, one of the biggest problems is the fact that credibility and popularity of the United States is declining in Southeast Asia or in broader global South countries. That is really a huge loss. And because US is our biggest ally, and the fact that the US is becoming less trusted, less credible in the eyes of those people, that's really a serious issue. And so that is why in such a context, sometimes we need to demonstrate that Europe and Japan are different from the United States, but if you go beyond certain point, then that would become a huge dilemma for us, because at the bottom we believe that we share important values with the United States and other like-minded countries, the US allies and partners in the world, but at the same time we need to get the countries with which we don't share values on board as well. And if you look at Southeast Asia, that they are wondering that they don't want to choose side. So but still, then and that is why that I think the message should be to demonstrate to those countries that there are non-Chinese alternatives as well. So and that is why it's very important for us to maintain the existence of various alternatives, because particularly in Southeast Asia, that the situation tends to become that the China option, China choice is dominant, and then the other alternatives become sometimes very invisible. But we need to make sure that always that there are alternatives. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Rory, would you like to get on these? Or again, looking at the time, and we have about 12 to 13 minutes for a last round.
Sure. No, I would like to touch on these themes. I may try to mention the AUKUS thing at the end if there's a moment. But look, I think the analysis from both my colleagues here has been spot on, and I think your own observation, Eva, that this is not about excluding China from the region. This is about providing alternatives and providing options, I think is absolutely right. If I look at the South Pacific, for example, where Australia is heavily focused, and our Foreign Minister has said quite openly, we are in a permanent contest for influence with China in the South Pacific. But it's that sea of many flags. It's having all of those other partners in the South Pacific and in Southeast Asia to help provide a range of options to countries and societies for their development choices, their education, their health, their infrastructure, including China, but not exclusively China. I think that's the key. And that's where we can find some convergence. I mean, I would just identify one other area. I know development assistance has been touched on, but I would also mention education. So, for example, I find it disappointing that we don't do more to coordinate the way that partner countries such as Australia, Japan, our European friends, the United Kingdom, Canada, and others work as education providers in Southeast Asia, where, frankly, we can all make a massive difference. We all have significant advantage in education in providing, whether it's tertiary education or vocational education. And we know from opinion surveys that populations in Southeast Asia would prefer to engage with our countries than with China. But they often go to China because it's the only option or there's the cost issue. So, I think there's some exciting possibilities for greater diplomatic coordination, whether it's on development assistance or education to provide those alternatives. Just two other brief points. Firstly, I mentioned earlier the idea of conflict prevention, and because we've talked a bit about countries in the global south, although that's an incredibly diverse range of countries. If we do focus again on Southeast Asia, which I think is really the pivot of the Indo-Pacific, no country in that sub-region, no ASEAN country wants conflict. They don't want the humanitarian or the economic or the sovereignty impacts of conflict. And they need friends and partners in trying to prevent conflict. So I think there's also a lot of opportunity for Japan, Europe, and Australia to work with those countries on, for example, thinking through what would the consequences of a conflict across the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea or East China Sea, what would the consequences be for their economies, their societies, their development, the consular safety of all of our people, and how do we work together with the mechanisms we've got to prevent that from happening. Last point on AUKUS, I just wanted to note that although there are some questions at the moment about AUKUS, the Trump administration is asking some questions about, what's the value, what's the deal for the United States in all of this. We have to remember that AUKUS is not only about submarines, it's about advanced technologies, cyber, hypersonics, quantum, and the like that could be game changers in security for all of our countries. And in fact, even in the implicit AUKUS agreements from the beginning, the door is open to eventual cooperation with fourth countries, whether it's with Japan or with European partners. So I think we should all keep that in mind over the long term as well. That's all I'll say.
Excellent, and not draw quick conclusions. I think I absolutely agree with you. And now I would like to give you space in the last round to, of course, also react to anything that has been said, but touch upon an issue. I mean, there's so much that has been said, really, and still a few questions, but I'll just kind of package it into a few thoughts. One thing we have not really touched upon, I mean, although indirectly, when you talk about diplomatic coordination among those countries that, on conflict prevention, for instance, or on connectivity, it really brings back the question of what could be the best channels? What is still the roles of multilateral structures? And it seems to me, and then I'm linking it also to some of the questions here in the chat, is, how can we engage with ASEAN? How can we engage with BRICS? And it still kind of brings us back to this question of how can we engage with all those in the rest? And it seems to me that we have also, based on what Michito said, this decreased confidence in the Western world, in Southeast Asia and in elsewhere. It seems that we have somehow failed to convince about the benefits of the multilateral rules-based liberal international order. So what can we do to fix that or try to remedy that? We have been talking about possible reforms of the WTO, which are crucially needed. Greater coordination on connectivity seems to be like a no-brainer, including perhaps with China on board, and some issues on energy, etc. So if you had to pick a few priorities in our scaffolding, right? What would be the main pillars? Is it going to be trade? Because of course, engaging with countries like Vietnam, and we on one hand face trade tariffs from the United States, or we have been kind of squeezed between the US and China. Of course, many countries feel those economic pressures, want to diversify, want those alternatives. So what would be the sort of best channel to deal with that? I know it's a huge question again, but it will hopefully give you, space to just think a bit forward in a positive way. And you have about 6 minutes. So please 2-3 minutes each max. Who wants to go first? So shuffle the order. We'll start with Michito, then Giulio, and we'll end with Rory as the most senior of all in a good way.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I have learned quite a lot from this conversation. I very much enjoyed it. My final sort of a positive message is that the rules-based international order is good for small countries, good for normal countries, good for small countries. And that's it, because that's really important, because for big ones like China, Russia, or even the United States, rules-based international order is a sort of a constraint. So those countries want to do whatever they want to do. But rules-based international order, international norms, international organizations, international laws, they are really crucial for medium-sized or small-sized normal countries, because those are the things that could protect your interest, and that is why. That is why the rules-based international order is not only for democracies, or it's not only for countries in the West. No, it's for all. It's for all normal countries. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you very much. Giulio?
I will echo Michito's remarks and emphasize and double down on the importance of keeping an open, free trade-based world economy, where free trade agreements can actually foster rules and coalesce rules. Europe has a massive market, as does Japan and Australia, and so having those markets open with free trade agreements is fundamental. Having the EU, Japan, and Australia in a plurilateral agreement, which is the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, but effectively tries to avoid the sabotaging of the World Trade Organization, is a good example of how we can actually still double down on rules and norms while welcoming the rise of the rest, so to speak, of emerging economies. And this is going to be important because it will empower them, it will option them, it will give them options, and it will also anchor them in the economic orbit of these very strong and powerful economies. And we can also leverage, to conclude with Rory's earlier remarks, our soft power. Australia is leveraging of sports diplomacy in its 600 million deal with Papua New Guinea, and the inclusion of Papua New Guinea in the National Rugby League speaks wonders about how much appeal and how much soft power and openness we have that actually wants, that can actually embrace the so-called global South also through education, as mentioned, but migration. And I'll stop blabbing here. I hope it's clear. Thank you.
You still have time. It's perfect. Thank you very much. Rory, would
Good,
you
thank
like
you.
to?
Yeah, and thanks to Giulio for his generous words about our sports diplomacy. Perhaps Europe's got some football diplomacy to be doing over here. But look, I would still focus on conflict prevention, but also free trade. I think both high priorities. In terms of the multilateral institutions we should work with, we shouldn't forget that there is actually a multilateral architecture in this region. It is centered on ASEAN. It has lots of flaws. It's been criticized for being slow and very focused on talk, but let's face it, a lot of multilateralism's like that. And the ASEAN-centric mechanisms should also be credited for a number of things. I mean, ASEAN has been effective at minimising conflict within itself, or minimising the escalation of conflict. Sometimes the whole point of ASEAN convening endless talk is part of the solution of really pushing problems into the future rather than having to confront them in the present. But when we look at some of these institutions, and I think for my sins, I've got a little bit of specialisation in things like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus. They all have actual agendas of preventing conflict, of managing the region's security. And I think it's incumbent on dialogue partners like our countries and our institutions to help those institutions live up to their promise and to work with ASEAN and with those institutions. So, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum was actually modelled on the OSCE. So there was a recognition that the European experience of preventing conflict during the Cold War could have lessons for Asia. That link is not dead. There's an opportunity to revive some of that thinking. And the EU is actually a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. So I do think there's an opportunity to try to revitalise institutions here. And that means perhaps a little bit of caucusing among some dialogue partners, but it also means identifying who in ASEAN we can work most effectively with as a kind of catalyst group to get that going. And I know that countries like Malaysia, Singapore seem quite interested in that, Philippines, obviously. And then finally on free trade, I would really endorse that view that we shouldn't give up the faith on free trade. We should live what we preach there. And again, there are plenty of significant economies in the region and globally that still reap the benefits of free trade and have a demonstration effect that we can bring to bear in the Indo-Pacific. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you all. I really wish we had another hour, so we could have, stick to, the many things that I was hoping we could discuss. But I hope that the audience has, gotten a good glimpse into, the current trends. I think one of the positives, and thank you for Rory for mentioning the importance of the ASEAN-led regional security architecture and the space for partners. I think this is extremely important and regretfully missing in these endless debates about great power, strategic competition, just kind of understandable in a way because we're handling so much and so many burning issues at our footsteps. So the good news is that there is a structure, and I think we should definitely use those to signal more loudly to our Southeast Asian or South Asian partners that we are happy to continue working in those structures. And it is also a platform that brings Japan, Australia, and Europeans together. I'm quite familiar with the IRF as well, and I think that there should be perhaps space also for some sort of minilaterals on the sidelines of those formats that would be more focused on delivering on some of the concrete promises. You talked about education, you talked about technologies, and things that come to my mind is AI, governance, some of those future crucially important things where the Europeans have some thing to offer. We don't always talk about the normative or regulatory power of the EU, so perhaps there's one thing that we can bring. indeed together to the table for a more stable and a secure region. And I won't be summarizing the rest. I think this is an ongoing conversation. We will hear about the results of the EU-China summit probably now as we finish. I don't think there's that much to be expected. I mean, I think it's also important to see that there is an ongoing channel of communication. I think it's been highlighted by all of you. That there needs to be an inclusive also approach depending on the topics, all that, keeping in mind all the challenges. So I will conclude with that. I will remind our participants to please scroll down to find a link to a post-webinar survey that will help to improve the series. And of course, the most important is to thank you all. Thank the government of Japan and Nikkei Global for allowing us to have this exchange, which has been, frankly, a fascinating one. I hope you have all enjoyed it and can now enjoy the summer heat, at least for us in Europe. I don't know, probably not in Australia, but thank you all for watching and stay tuned to the works of our three great speakers on this exciting, evolving subject. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.